Silence is not the opposite of words. It is their foundation. At first, this sounds contradictory. We're used to thinking of silence as the absence of speech, a blank space, an empty void, the nothing that happens when nobody says anything. Yet if you listen more carefully, silence is the very ground from which words arise. Without silence, no sound could ever be heard. Without the pause between notes, no music could ever exist. Silence does not erase words. It gives them shape, rhythm, and meaning. Think of a night sky filled with stars. If the entire sky were flooded with light, you would never notice the stars at all. They only shine because of the dark. In the same way, every word we speak is framed by silence, as a star is framed by the infinite black of space. Without the silence, the word is just noise, lost, directionless, meaningless. And yet, in our lives, we so often treat silence as the enemy. We rush to fill it in conversations with nervous chatter. We fear it on a first date, at a dinner table, or in a meeting room, as if silence means failure. We mistake stillness for emptiness, and emptiness for insignificance. But what if this is the greatest misunderstanding of all? Nature has always known otherwise. A tree does not grow by constant motion. It grows in silence. A river does not rush every second with chaos. It flows in quiet patience, finding its way by stillness as much as by movement. The deepest truths in life are never shouted. They are whispered in the spaces in between. So here lies the paradox. Silence is not weakness. Silence is not absence. Silence is the source. The question then becomes, what happens when we stop fearing the silence behind every word, and instead begin to listen to it? There was once a young man who dreaded silence. At family dinners, he would talk endlessly, afraid that if he paused, the quiet would feel heavy and awkward. At work, in meetings, he filled every gap with explanations, statistics, reassurances, as if silence meant he wasn't competent. Even with his closest friends, he felt a strange panic when conversations slowed. He would force a joke, bring up the weather, or scroll his phone just to avoid that uncomfortable pause. One day, he visited an old friend who lived in the countryside. They sat together on a porch overlooking the fields as the sun sank behind the hills. For a while, they chatted, laughing about old memories. Then, naturally, the conversation faded. The crickets began their evening chorus. The wind stirred the tall grass. The young man, out of habit, reached for another topic, but his friend simply smiled, leaned back, and said nothing. Minutes passed. The silence stretched. At first, the young man's chest tightened. His mind scrambled for words. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as though silence revealed too much. But then, something curious happened. As he stopped resisting the quiet, he noticed the glow of fireflies blinking over the meadow. He noticed the way the air cooled on his skin, carrying the faint scent of earth after a hot day. He noticed the steady presence of his friend beside him. No pressure, no performance, just companionship. The silence was not empty. It was full. In that stillness, he realized something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Connection without effort. Words had always been his tool to hold people close, to prove his value, to keep control. But here, in the absence of words, he felt more understood than in all the conversations he'd ever forced. Later that night, as they parted ways, his friend finally spoke. You see, silence doesn't take anything away. It gives everything back. From that evening on, the young man's relationship with silence began to shift. He no longer rushed to fill every gap. He started to listen more, and slowly the silence that once terrified him became his teacher. What that young man discovered on the porch is something life has been trying to teach us all along. Silence is not an interruption of life. It is the very rhythm that makes life possible. Think about music. If you remove the pauses, the rests, the empty beats, what you're left with is just endless noise. It is the spaces between the notes that allow melody to exist. A symphony depends not only on what is played, but on what is not played. In the same way, our lives depend not only on what we say, do, and strive for, but also on the spaces of stillness that allow meaning to arise. Nature has always obeyed this law. The forest is alive, not just because of the trees, but because of the quiet soil in which they grow. The ocean is vast, not just because of its waves, but because of the silent depths that hold them. Even breath itself follows this rhythm. Inhale, pause, exhale, pause. Without the silence of the pause, the breath cannot be sustained. And yet, we humans are often terrified of that pause. We treat stillness as wasted time, silence as something to be fixed. But in doing so, we cut ourselves off from the very ground of our being. The truth is that silence is not a void to be filled. It is a presence to be experienced. Alan Watts once observed, "We don't come into this world, we come out of it, as leaves from a tree." In the same way, our words do not enter into silence, they emerge from it. Silence is not the absence of life, it is life itself, holding everything in balance. When we allow silence to be part of our lives, something extraordinary happens. We begin to hear not just what is said, but what is meant. We begin to feel not just the surface of things, but their depth. And most importantly, we begin to rest, not in distraction, not in endless activity, but in the stillness that has been here all along. So the principle is simple, though it feels radical. If you want your life to have harmony, you must honor the silence between the notes. There are always two ways we can move through life, the way of noise and the way of silence. The first path is the one most of us know too well. It is the path of constant chatter, endless planning, relentless effort. On this path, every silence feels threatening, so we drown it out with words, music, scrolling, or busyness. We fill our schedules so tightly that there is no room left to breathe. The result? We become exhausted, anxious, and strangely disconnected, even when surrounded by people. Our conversations become like crowded rooms, where everyone shouts at once, but nobody listens. Life turns into static, and we lose the melody. The second path is quieter, but infinitely richer. It is the path of stillness. On this path, silence is not an enemy, but a companion. It is the pause before we answer, the breath before we act, the space that allows connection to deepen. When we walk this path, we discover that words land more gently, relationships feel less forced, and life itself feels less like a battle and more like a dance. Think of a society, one built on total control. A dictatorship leaves no space for dissent, no silence for reflection. It may appear orderly, but underneath it is brittle, fearful, and suffocating. Contrast that with a democracy, messy, filled with pauses, debates, and moments of quiet uncertainty. Yet it is precisely this openness, this willingness to leave space, that allows it to grow stronger. Or picture music, a soloist who insists on playing every note without pause leaves the audience overwhelmed and exhausted. But a symphony, where each instrument has its moment and the rests shape the rhythm, creates harmony that can move us to tears. So too with our lives. The path of noise promises control, but delivers isolation. The path of silence feels uncertain, but it leads to connection, freedom, and ease. Here is the one-liner that captures it. Noise shouts for attention, but silence creates meaning. And when we remember this, we see that our choice is not between speaking and saying nothing, but between living in constant static, or discovering the music that only silence can reveal. Silence is simple, but it is not shallow. The more we enter it, the more mysterious it becomes. We live in a culture that worships answers. We want definitions, certainty, conclusions. To say, "I don't know," feels like weakness. But silence whispers a different truth, that not knowing is not a failure. It is freedom. Think about it. The eye cannot see itself directly. The knife cannot cut itself. The flame cannot burn itself. There are limits built into perception, and these limits are not flaws. They are invitations. They remind us that reality is always larger than our grasp, always more spacious than our categories. Silence is the place where this mystery reveals itself. In silence, we are no longer trapped by our explanations. We can sit with the vastness of life without rushing to shrink it into words. And paradoxically, it is only in this openness that we begin to truly understand. Alan Watts often said that the greatest wisdom begins with wonder. To embrace silence is to step into wonder, to admit that the universe is not something we can pin down, but something we can participate in. Silence does not solve the mystery, it deepens it. Imagine staring at the night sky. If you demand to know exactly what every star is, why it burns, how far it is, you reduce the sky to a chart of data. But if you allow yourself to simply stand in silence beneath it, something else awakens. Awe. The stars do not need to explain themselves for their beauty to reach you. The same is true of silence in our lives. We don't need to fill every pause with explanations, nor every unknown with certainty. In fact, it is the silence that makes room for new possibilities, for truths we have not yet imagined. So perhaps the real invitation of stillness is this: not to conquer the silence with words, but to let silence teach us how to live with the unknown, to rest in the mystery instead of fearing it. Because in the end, silence is not emptiness at all. It is the space where the infinite can breathe. We began with a paradox. Silence is not the opposite of words, but the source of them. And now, after walking through story, principle, and mystery, we can finally see why. Every moment of life carries within it both sound and silence, action and stillness. But we are taught to worship only the sound, only the action, to value what is visible, measurable, and loud. That is why silence feels uncomfortable. It reminds us of what we cannot control. Yet this very discomfort is what makes silence so powerful. Because when we stop running from it, silence becomes a friend. It reveals that impermanence is not our enemy, but our companion. The pauses, the endings, the moments of not knowing are not obstacles. They are the rhythm of life itself. Leaves fall, rivers pause in their meanders, seasons turn. And through it all, silence is there, not as a void, but as the hidden music behind everything. Alan Watts once remarked, "You cannot be more silent than silence itself. It is already here." This is the gift of stillness. It is not something we need to create, but something we need to notice. Every word you speak is already carried by silence, the way every wave is carried by the ocean. So let us return to the question. What happens when we stop fearing the silence behind every word? What happens is this: our conversations grow deeper, our relationships become more authentic, our minds find rest, and our hearts, at last, begin to hear the music that has been playing all along. Silence is not an absence to be filled. It is a presence to be honored. And when we learn to trust it, life itself begins to feel lighter, freer, more whole. So here is the invitation, simple yet profound. Do not rush to fill the silence. Let it stay. Let it breathe. Let it teach you. Because behind every word you will ever speak, there is a silence waiting to embrace it. And perhaps, if you listen closely, you will find that silence has been speaking all along.